Okay, so we are right at probably a few seconds after 11 a.m., so we want to get started just in lieu of your time today. Thanks for joining us today. As I mentioned previously, this is the third part of a series FME has been doing for the last few months on mergers and acquisitions. And today we have a special guest from Adlib. It's actually Adlib's presentation for us today, which is great, on elevating unstructured content. So the webinar today is in listen-only mode, so you are muted. At the end of the session, you can direct all questions through the chat directly to the organizer. We will read them accordingly and then answer them aloud. Please note the session is also recorded, and you have the ability to go back and view it again or share with your colleagues, and we'll post that as well for folks that weren't able to make it today. So I'm Larissa Primavera. I'm the Director of Sales for our FME US team here in Danbury, Connecticut. And our special guest today is Scott Mackey, Vice President of Customer Success from Adlib Software. And we'll talk today about elevating unstructured content with Adlib progressive classification. And with that, Scott, we're going to turn it over to you to provide us with your great presentation.
That's great. Thanks, Larissa. Just get the logistics going here, make sure my screen shows up properly. All good? All right, wonderful. So, yeah, thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar today. As Larissa indicated, we're going to talk a little bit about this notion of elevating unstructured content, and we're going to be talking about some new capabilities from Adlib around this notion of progressive classification. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the use cases and technology advancements that we've been introducing over the last little while. I'm going to take a mostly educational approach to this. I mean, obviously, we want to talk a little bit about Adlib's capabilities here, but it is really about getting people to think a little bit differently about how they're actually managing some of their content from an information governance perspective. Let's start off with a little bit about Adlib. I saw some familiar names on the webinar registration list, so many of you are familiar with Adlib. We actually have been adjusting and expanding our portfolio of solutions over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. So the Adlib of 5 years ago is actually quite different today. We have expanded our capabilities in some pretty significant ways. But in general terms, the way we describe ourselves, obviously, as an enterprise software platform, a key part of what we've been doing for well over 12 years is around this automated content standardization. We're also getting more into the analysis, classification, and optimization of content that suits multiple different workflows within different lines of business within an organization. And what we're working on with organizations is to help them understand, leverage, and control massive volumes of content as part of a broader information governance strategy. So whereas we started in sort of advanced rendering, we're actually now being involved in much more significant use case type applications related to information governance within different industries. So as far as sample use cases go, there's a couple of traditional ones here. We're quite well known in the life sciences pharma space for automating the creation of FDA submissions content, so PDF, PDFA, that sort of thing. Most of the top pharma organizations work with us directly or use our technology through a number of our partners that are in the market right now. We also do things like normalizing content for the European Parliament. So you can imagine all the different member countries submitting content, Adlib being a consistent, scalable service that renders all that content to a consistent format is another sort of traditional use case. We're also used by a lot of the major insurance organizations to streamline the claims processing. So it's all about improving the customer experience. So instead of manually assembling claims that can then be reviewed and assessed by the claims processing staff, we can help automate a lot of that workflow so you can get faster turnaround times, improve the overall customer experience and whatnot. There's also a lot of sort of standard archival workflow. So anybody that has information governance spans multiple disciplines, but archival is a key aspect of that. And a lot of Adlib technology is used to archive the hundreds of different formats that we support, whether it's email, CAD, or your standard MS Office content, to long-term formats such as PDFA, searchable PDFA. But when we start talking about progressive classification, there's some new twists to this notion of creating a long-term accessible archive of content, or by extracting maximum value from the content flowing through your organization. So hopefully we can paint a bit of a picture there for you today. I did put this little tile in. We tend to speak a little more about the business applications, but for those of you on the call that might be on the IT side, where these stories are interesting, a little bit about Adlib from a technology perspective. It is a scalable enterprise shared service. It's driven by metadata. We're tightly integrated across multiple lines of business. So whether you refer to a content management system, ERP, PLM, pick your acronym to a certain extent. SharePoint. There's a lot of different integrations that we can leverage. We support hundreds of different formats. So this notion of unstructured content being anything that flows through the organization that isn't database stored, the structured content. We focus on the unstructured content. Lots of different output formats. We're well known for our PDF and PDFA. We're going to go well beyond that in our discussion today, but we do have multiple output formats. A lot of different document publishing operations as well that get leveraged, again, depending on the business process being automated. But certainly OCR, stamping, redaction, highlighting, document security, and a number of new capabilities around data extraction, similarity indexing, content fingerprinting, and some of these cool new things that Adlib is introducing to the market based on our many years of deep knowledge of the content that we're working on that flows through our platform. So hopefully that gives some of you that maybe aren't as familiar with Adlib a bit of a sense of who we are. So the main topic, as Larissa was mentioning, was around mergers and acquisitions, and there's a host of trends out there. Nothing surprising. Essentially, this graphic is just painting the picture that it's a big deal. It's growing. It's a huge factor in the market today. The numbers here are showing that in 2015, there was over 46,000 M&As worldwide, and it represented over $4.5 trillion worth of transactions. So it's a significant impact, I guess, on the market, and the flow of content that results from this, you can imagine, is very significant, and the importance of classifying or managing that content is equally as important. When you look at some of the KPMG reports around the primary reasons that companies are doing this M&A activity, I wanted to highlight a couple of key things here. The first one that we're going to talk a little bit about today from a use case perspective is that when you're buying or selling companies, primarily when you're buying a company, you're doing it for a reason. You're getting access to a new market, new customer base. You're getting access to new intellectual property or knowledge. So your ability to quickly extract and leverage that knowledge and information, intellectual property is pretty key. So that's a key topic of the discussion that we have today. But also in terms of what's the most important factor in terms of making an M&A exercise successful, you can see what was highlighted here, again by KPMG, this idea of a well-executed integration plan. And beyond that, it's not just the people and systems that need to be integrated. Obviously, that's a key problem. But integrating the content from that newly acquired asset is a key challenge that people have. You've got different repositories. You've got different formats. You've got information that's of all kinds of different vintages, old and new, and in all these different formats. So the volume, variety, and velocity of information flowing into and through an organization is only growing. So a well-executed integration plan is key. But also highlighted here is around this importance around effective due diligence and content analytics being an essential part of a successful merger and acquisition. So when we talk about progressive classification and the migration-centric capabilities from FME, these are key elements of making sure that an M&A activity is successful in the end, and not at a small scale, but at an enterprise scale. Typically what we're dealing with. So again, we're not going to go into a whole lot about Adlib specifically in terms of the technology, but this is useful in terms of some of the typical business challenges that we are seeing out in the marketplace and how they relate to M&A activity, specifically content migration. We see stories there. Obviously, content migration is a key aspect of mergers and acquisitions, but even an organization that hasn't gone through any M&A activity is constantly dealing with content migration as a challenge. New systems, obsolete technologies, legacy repositories, shifts in strategy that mean that what may have been siloed information needs to be brought together. Content moving from one geography to another. There's all kinds of different use cases and scenarios where content migration is a key challenge. So that's going to be a key focus for us today. But obviously, when you're dealing with M&A, there are other key business challenges that may factor in as well. being compliant with whatever regulations are in place. And that's not just internal regulations, it's primarily the external regulations that may have actual financial implications if you're not in compliance. So that's something else that being able to understand all of what you've inherited, if we're talking about M&A content, compliance is a key consideration. Another big thing that comes up in the customer conversations that we have is around privacy and security. So when you're bringing in this content, you really need to understand what you've got and find out where in that content might there be some risk in terms of things like personally identifiable information, the PII, or commercially confidential information, the stuff that basically needs to have some sort of security and privacy put around it. That's another important factor in why you need to understand all of the content that you're working with. Digital transformation, classification, these are a couple of other key challenges, but as I mentioned, we're going to focus more on content migration. And as I mentioned, I'm not going to go into detail about the specific Adlib solution in this space, but we refer to it as the content elevation process. You see here standardize, analyze, categorize, optimize. There's a number of different capabilities here, but in particular, we're going to focus on progressive classification as the overall topic as it relates to content migration in this particular story today. So when we talk about mergers and acquisitions, as I mentioned, the goal is to understand and leverage all of those new revenue-related assets. So, when we talk about utilities companies that will purchase a competitor, there's a lot of revenue-related assets that they've inherited, and they want to quickly get control or understanding over that information when they bring it in. A lot of our pharma customers, obviously that's a great way to grow, is to acquire companies that have a larger pipeline. Well, there's a lot of intellectual property and revenue-related assets and content in that organization that you need to quickly get a handle on. But as I mentioned before, there's also risk potentially in some of the contracts and policies that are inherited when you're dealing with this as well. We talk about some financial services, the banking industry. When you purchase a bank, you're inheriting a lot of potential risk in the contracts and customer information that's in there. So you need to be able to assess that risk. So it's not just about leveraging value, it's also about managing your overall risk. The idea to quickly identify, separate, and then leverage that high-value intellectual property. And a key aspect of this in content migration in general, but specifically in mergers and acquisitions as well, there's an awful lot of rot, the redundant, obsolete, and trivial information. And the idea here is that you don't want to have to try to store it all, manage it all. You want to get rid of the rot first. So you want to decommission what's unnecessary and really focus on governing what matters. We've got several projects where I think in the one scenario, it was a specific customer project, one of many, but it was around 1 million files, and what they found that there was actually 35% of the content was duplicate. So you can imagine if you can clean that stuff out, then you've made the list of information that you actually need to manage more effectively that much smaller. Excuse me. So a quick note here just about the relationship between FME and Adlib. Obviously, you're probably familiar with FME and its migration center, the idea that they tie very deeply into the source material on one side and are able to effectively automate the transition of that content to multiple output sources. So the idea here is that Adlib can tie right into that middle process where after it's been extracted, if you can clean it up, categorize it, extract information, and essentially attribute it so that you're enriching the information prior to it getting ingested on the other side, you're going to get more value out of that information. You're going to be able to better manage the risk associated with any information that might be risky in that content. So it's not a perfect workflow diagram, but just the idea that Adlib works with the FME Migration Center as part of an overall content migration solution. So one of the first ideas here is don't wait for there to be a problem. Think about classification first. So a lot of what we are getting involved in is projects where customers have already got an issue. They've got a big repository of content that they need to chew through, and that's fine. We can deal with those things, processing through the millions or hundreds of millions of files so that you can start to get a handle on the content, make it searchable, get rid of the rot, and govern what matters, as I mentioned before. But eventually you want to get to a point where it's not just doing the back file conversion and processing stuff that you've already got. It's actually thinking about this stuff at the outset. So when we talk about mergers and acquisitions, if you think about classification not as an afterthought, don't get all the content in, dump it in your repository, put a security fence around it, and then worry about classifying it. If you can put a system or a workflow in place that is proactively classifying this content, giving you a better understanding of what's coming in, cleaning out the rot, enriching the metadata or enriching the properties and whatnot of the content that you're dealing with as it's coming in, then you're setting yourself up for longer-term success. You don't have to clean it up later. I mean, you can certainly do that, but the idea here is that a lot of the customers that we're working with have an existing problem they want to get a handle on, but their longer-term goal, their longer-term strategy is to actually think about classification first. So at the point of capture, at the point of ingestion, at the point of creation eventually, you want to be able to capture as much information about the content being created as possible. One of the key challenges related to that, of course, is what are you getting from the information? At a very basic level, file statistics are there, right? Everybody can see that in your Windows Explorer, the file size, the file type, even some of the basic properties about author and keywords and that sort of thing. But that's not really giving you the rich information that you need. You can't effectively govern content based on the file statistics alone. The next step, of course, is user-provided, and we all know, you can just imagine the eyes rolling around user-provided. It's not only frustrating for the users themselves to have to fill in all these fields when they're profiling their content, but it just doesn't work. There's all kinds of stats and things out there. We talked about the 93% of organizations use manual tagging, and the manual approach will fail 95% of the time. These aren't our stats, but these are sort of industry stats that are out there. Might be a little bit extreme, but you get the point. We talked to some of our customers, a couple of the big enterprise ones, and one of the comments from the VP of Information Governance was to really get the most out of their content, they'd actually have to get the users to fill in about 50 different profile fields, because there's all kinds of different uses and audiences for the content, and you're never going to get a user to fill those things out. I believe the statistics are you've got about 5 to 7 seconds of a user's time. Otherwise, they just start filling in the default information or not filling it in at all if it's not mandatory. So user-provided metadata is just not an effective solution for that. As the systems grow in sophistication, there is additional system metadata, things like workflows and whatnot that help to augment what is considered properties for that file. So if you know what business processes the content has flowed through, you can start to automatically apply some of that information as metadata or as classification criteria. But again, it's a little bit limited in that it depends on how it's flowed through the organization. It depends on what systems it's stored in, and if those systems change, does it get contained. Quite often this information is stored separate from the document itself, so it doesn't necessarily travel with the content, so it can be quite challenging. The ultimate, of course, is to combine these things with also a deep content awareness, essentially knowing what is in the document itself and having the system intelligently apply the right information about that content. It recognizes what it is, not just based on the surface level properties, but based on the internal content and structure itself. That's sort of the ultimate. And that's really what we're starting to talk about here when we talk about progressive classification and content fingerprinting, and I'll get into some of those things in a minute here. So as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that we've seen is that people will just quickly ingest all this content and put a fence around it. We've heard the term tripwire, that sort of thing. But what I guess the notion that we're delivering here, and we've done this with a number of clients, is that putting up security fences isn't the solution. You have to understand what you've got, clean up that redundant stuff, get the important information properly classified and attributed, get the information that contains risk properly segmented and potentially automatically redacted, for example, which we'll talk about a little bit today, and govern what matters. So, the trivial stuff, the emails between coworkers around recipes, that's trivial content. Don't worry too much about that. Put that into a bucket and manage that according to the level of importance. But if you've got contracts and other high-risk material, things that might contain personally identifiable information, you need to really understand that you've got that stuff, put it into a consistent place, and govern it accordingly. It's not enough to take all this stuff, put it into a system, and put a security fence around it. It's never going to work, certainly not long-term. When we look at some of the market information around information governance drivers, we try not to be fear mongers when we do these webinar sessions, because there is this balance between getting value from your content as well as protecting yourself from the risk inherent in it. But when you look at things like the surveys from AIM and others, I put little exclamation marks beside the areas that are really identified as risk. This is the fear side of the equation, I suppose, and there's very few of these items that are really related to, you know what, there's value buried in that content, and there's an opportunity here using things like classification and capture to extract it. So the third one here touches on that, you know, creating searchable knowledge for future reference so that you don't have to recreate content, so that it's accessible, so that you can actually leverage the full value of the content that you've got. But everything else here, compliance with legal and regulatory rules, preventing data loss and privacy breaches, securing your IP and competitive or sensitive information, supporting litigation, you know, e-discovery types of workflows, the ability to respond to FOIA requests, again, regulatory stuff, these are all risks. So there's a little bit of a heavier weighting on the risk side of the equation. If you read any articles related to information governance these days, that tends to be the overall slant. But there are both opportunities that can be derived from an effective solution, such as Migration Center and the progressive classification that we're talking about from Adlib. This is just re-emphasizing some of the points I was making earlier, just about the significance of this rot problem. I mentioned the one customer project had about 35% of its content was a duplicate, never mind what was obsolete or trivial. I'm not saying that's typical. You know, that was probably a little bit high, but there is a huge portion. You know, you see the study here from the IDC report regarding just how much of the content flowing through an organization or stored in an organization is actually considered rot. We've talked to a couple of really big enterprise customers, one in pharma in particular comes to mind, where we were told that for any one document, there's probably 18 copies of it throughout the organization. You know, if you think of what's been sent as an email attachment, what's been stored locally on somebody's hard drive, what's been stored in a repository, what was copied from a legacy repository. You know, the notion that it's not just the rot, that you've got multiple copies of content makes it a real challenge. So that's where, again, the notion of progressive classification, content fingerprinting, being able to not only group content based on similarity, but using some of these advanced techniques to identify specific duplicate content so that you can effectively not only find it, but then manage it accordingly, according to your rules. The other notion here, too, is that businesses and regulations change over time. So it's not like you can put a system like this in place, get it all configured and set up, and have it chew through the content either from a project perspective or from an ongoing perspective, and then leave it alone. Things are going to change over time. You know, regulations will change. You need to start to classify it differently, maybe with additional levels of detail, or things change in terms of what you need to capture or how something needs to be classified. So this notion that you can put one system in place and then walk away from it doesn't make sense either. Whatever solution you want to put in place needs to have that adaptability so that your subject matter experts, the people that know your industry, that know your business, are able to go in and easily change the configuration of the system so that information can be updated or captured and classified in a different and unique way as things change. And being able to go back to the information that was already processed and be able to re-deal with it. You know, you've already done some of the upfront work. You've done a better job at putting it into the right places. You've got it classified properly, not in broad strokes, but in a much more detailed way. So then if a regulation changes, you can easily identify the bucket of content that needs to be updated. And if you have to reprocess it, fine. If you don't, you can simply update some of the values and attributes that may need to be managed. So just this notion that change is going to be constant, so make sure that the system that you're putting in place is adaptable to that. And you know, tools like the FME Migration Center, you may solve a problem now. In 5 years, you may have a merger and acquisition. That content may have to move. You may have a big vendor that's bought by another vendor, and you may choose strategically to shift your content from one place to another. So planning for change is obviously something that you need to think about or put into your planning. The other interesting thing is around big data analytics. So most of the industry articles that you read on this, certainly the ones that I read, focus on big data, and it's this fantastic story, and it really is. But a lot of what they talk about is content analytics based on structured data. So all of the transactions that you or I do online or through the various institutions that we work with, all of those things stored in a database. There's rich information that companies can glean from that to do some pretty impressive things that do add value to us as consumers. But there's a whole, if you think of the statistics, and I mentioned one here, that it varies, right? But look at one industry analyst or another. They all say it's a big portion of it, whether it's 90% or not. 80 to 90% of an organization's content is unstructured. So the stuff that's not stored in a database. The Word documents, the CAD drawings, the email messages, all of the information that is sitting in your organization, a big chunk of it is unstructured. And there's no reason why the content being fed into the big data analytics engines can't come from that unstructured data. Most of the articles are focused on dealing with structured data, but you can open a pipeline essentially to your unstructured content using some of these tools. And it's not just taking paper and scanning it and turning that into searchable content that can then be fed in. You can take all the born digital content and start to feed that content into your analytics engines. We got a large reinsurance customer in Europe that essentially is taking their content, unstructured content essentially, and feeding that into Watson, essentially, and it's basically doing some really rapid risk assessment of the contracts being fed into the system. You talk about 500 million pages a year. The volume of content that you can feed in and the value you can get out of it can be very significant. There's an article I read recently from, actually it was probably a few months ago, Royal Bank of Scotland. It's a public thing, not a customer of ours, at least not in this sense, but where what they were after was delivering a superior overall customer experience. And what they were doing was basically combing through all of the different disparate resources they had or information they had on their customers, and not violating privacy things, but basically analyzing all the different financial products that a customer had and identify where they may be paying duplicates. You've got this financial product and you have this financial product. You're paying insurance on both. The insurance on one covers you for both. So it's about identifying that information and revealing that to a customer proactively so that you're improving the overall customer experience. A lot of the article was focused again around structured information that the bank had access to, but you can imagine what they've got in their systems in terms of signed contracts and other documents that are unstructured content from that same customer. If you can stream that into your overall analytics engine, there's just that much more value you can extract from the information, and therefore deliver even more value to your customers. Just as an example. So big data analytics, it's a buzzword these days. My key message here is that using things like the Progressive Classification and Migration Center, you can start to expose this huge volume of unstructured content to those content analytics engines. And it's a bit of a garbage in, garbage out scenario. You want to clean it up, remove the rot, get the stuff properly categorized and classified, and then feed in the high value stuff. Don't feed all your emails about recipes and lunch dates into the content analytics engine. Get that separated out, get it cleaned up, but take your contracts and specific areas of contracts and feed that into your analytics engines and get the most value from it. Excuse me. So this kind of touches a little bit on that. So it's moving your overall approach to your information above just oversight, knowing what content you've got and putting some wrappers around it, getting a handle on the content, which most organizations honestly are still struggling with. Everybody has the quote-unquote X drive or E drive where everybody stores a local copy of something. So, you want to get just basic level control. So certainly that's valuable from a certain perspective in terms of getting some basic level oversight. But as you start to mine into that content, get better handle on it, better understand what you've got, clean up the rot, and understand and classify what you've got in your unstructured content, then you start to move beyond just oversight into actual insight and foresight. And that's what I was talking about with that Royal Bank example there, about if you can get that kind of insight and foresight into the content that you've got around a customer, you can deliver a lot of value to them. So in terms of using that information to proactively solve informations and generate some opportunities that are adding real value to your customers, whether those are internal customers, your business users, line of business users, or your external customers in terms of actual clients. So that's really what we're talking about, being able to do when you start to get a better handle on your unstructured content. So, what is progressive classification? We kind of touched on it in a few different ways here. So, again, it's built on some of these capabilities that Adlib's been building really for the last over 12 years. The idea that you can standardize all this unstructured information. It's not just the volume of it, but imagine the the disparate formats that are involved in that, whether it's Office, both new and old, CAD, email, images, PowerPoint, spreadsheets, the idea that you could standardize all this content into high-definition assets. And when I talk about that, we're referring to normalizing it to a format such as PDF, making it searchable, fixing the flow of the content. This is, in no small part of the magic here is that the columns and flow of information within the content is essential to effectively understanding what you've got. So even if at the end of the day you don't need PDF as your ultimate a rendition of it, it's a great way to standardize content into a high-definition asset from the born digital state. So it's still got all its structure, its hyperlinks, all of the value that was in the source files, so that you can properly understand it and effectively manage it. So that's a key aspect of it, is the standardization. The fingerprinting is where it gets kind of interesting as well. Adlib's got some unique intellectual property around, again, based on this deep internal content insight that we've built over the last 12 years or more. We understand the flow of content, the text, the images, the links, the structure. We understand everything about the internals, and we've had to do that to create this high-definition output that we've been known for the last 10 or 12 years. But that deep internal insight has also given us some unique ability to create a unique and distinct and very small fingerprint. And that fingerprint can then be used to not only do some bucketing of similar content, documents or content that have similar fingerprints, but you can also do some really cool analytics around finding matching fingerprints or fingerprints that are very close to being the same. Now you can start to find either the same document or versions of a document or renditions of a document. You can imagine a Word document and a PDF that are exactly the same, except the format is different. The fingerprint would be very, very similar, but not exactly the same. So there's some really cool things around fingerprinting that are part of this notion of progressively classifying your content and essentially doing the next step, which is around the objective analysis of the similarity. So, I use the analogy, and it's hard for me to do this over a webinar without waving my arms in the air, but we're all familiar with documents within our organizations, certain templates that if they were stuck to a wall as you walk by them, an invoice or a customer correspondence or a purchase order, if they were stuck on the wall and you were walking by really quickly, you'd probably be able to pick those things out just because of the overall look and structure of it, even without looking at the specific words. So what we're talking about here is you can teach the machine to do that if you have this deep internal content insight. If you can sort of teach the machine to sort of say, these are the rules around which this would be classified as an invoice, this would be classified as customer correspondence, you can start to do some really powerful things about objectively classifying your content. And then once you've got it in the right buckets and right classification areas, you can start to do some really powerful things about extracting information from it, whether you want to extract attributes that can be applied as metadata, whether you want to do things like look for patterns associated with things that might be personally identifiable, like credit card numbers or phone numbers. These are things that you can now start to reveal by using some of these deep internal content awareness that we've got. And this idea that it's a teachable system. So as I mentioned before, you need to have something that's flexible, that it's not necessarily custom coded. It needs to be a configurable environment where your subject matter experts, the people that are in your industry, that are in your company, that know know the documents and know how it's going to change over time, can essentially write the rules that design what the machine is going to be doing, what the computer and the software are going to be doing, and adjust it over time. So it's an important interface between the two, the technology and the subject matter experts, with a goal of increasingly capturing in an automatic way as much of this classification information as possible. We avoid, and we specifically avoid using the word auto-classification because it's probably an impossible goal to get it all fully automated. But if you can do a big chunk of it, if you can put the right rules in place written by those subject matter experts, you can do a huge portion of it. And as the volumes and velocities grow, that's going to be essential. We see enterprises throwing people at it, and they drown as soon as they start. So they can't do it manually. It has to be done using a combination of technology and the subject matter experts. Okay, so how is it unique? Well, what I've been talking about is that it's more than just metadata. It's more than just paper capture. We're talking about things like the industry-leading OCR. So you need to be able to capture information from non-searchable images if you do have them. It's about this objective similarity analysis. It's about support for born digital content, so hundreds of different formats. Again, a lot of the traditional tools in the marketplace follow one or the other paradigm. They're either just using the surface level metadata, or they're turning everything into an image and trying to capture it from there. We support the stuff right from its born digital state, so you don't lose any of that inherent value in the content itself. I've touched on this as well, this deep content analysis leading to this powerful fingerprinting capability, rules-driven data extraction, enterprise-level scalability. These are all some of the things that are unique about the progressive classification solution that we're talking about with Adlib. So I'll move away from my little vendor pitchy slide here. Oh, the other thing, of course, is the intuitive user experience. So that's something that we focused a lot on. Again, people on the webinar that are familiar with Adlib realize that we're primarily a back office solution, server-based solution. We plug in. It's a scalable enterprise shared service. But when you start getting into this progressive classification space, there's a need to expose some tools and assets for the subject matter experts to start to configure the system, visualize the information that's coming through and being bucketed and being classified, so that they can affect the outcome and update the rules and whatnot. So an intuitive user experience is a key part of what we're talking about here as well. Classification versus progressive. So a little bit of the difference from the traditional versus the progressive approach. So from a metadata perspective, I mentioned before, it's historically been an end user applied exercise, and that's inconsistent, versus something that can be system generated, where it can be derived from the configuration and the rules. It can be much more in-depth and much more powerful, and obviously much more consistently applied. Identifying the content has historically been kind of limited and randomly initiated, so sometimes people think of classification, and it's usually on a very finite basis, on a project basis, or focused on a particular format. What we're talking about with progressive is support for all of that unstructured content, making it comprehensive and automatic as much as possible. The business processing, whether going from ad hoc to being something that's a true organizational service that can be taught and can learn over time and can adjust to changes in business or regulations. Privacy, I use the word hope there intentionally. You know, traditionally it's really been across the fingers and hope you get a handle on the information that might contain risk in the organization, stuff that might have personally identifiable information. What we're talking about is make that objective, make it more reliable, figure out what kind of content might contain PII, what are contracts and what do they look like, start to separate those things out, and then do a more in-depth management and analysis of that content, and ignore the rot stuff. You know, stop crossing your fingers and put some things in place that can actually help you get control over information that needs to remain private. And then overall, from a governance perspective, traditionally it's been classifying by a fixed taxonomy, again, tied to manual data entry. What we're talking about is a different approach, a progressive approach, which is more flexible. So as requirements change, you can affect not only what's coming through new, but you can go back to existing information and start to update it as well, so that it reflects those new changes. So as just a quick final comment here before we get to questions. As I mentioned throughout, it's this notion of migration center combined with Adlib's progressive classification allow you to do a bit of both, right? It's about fully leveraging the assets that you've got buried in that content, but also controlling risk. I mean, I don't want to gloss over the fact that that is a key driver, a key concern. You know, a lot of the organizations that we're dealing with have got boards that are mandating that their information management people keep the company out of the news, right? They know they've got this content, not just in repositories, but spread throughout the organization, and they know they need to get control of it, not just because of the news, but because of the actual liability associated with it from a financial risk perspective. But as I mentioned, I don't want to focus completely on that. That is a key driver and a key consideration. But it's also this notion that there's a lot of value buried in this unstructured content, and using tools like FME and Adlib allow you to get a better handle on that content as it flows through. So hopefully that gave you a couple of ideas and some hints as to some of the use cases. There's lots to talk about, so certainly I hope there's a few questions that come through. And I know that both FME and certainly Adlib would be happy to talk to anybody that has more questions about what's going on in this information governance space, and specifically with regards to classification. So that's it. Q&A.
Yeah,
Larissa, I don't know if you want to take that back or.
Sure, we'll get that back to me. So yeah, if there are any questions, you can feel free and send them to the organizer and panelists in the chat, and we will answer them accordingly.
So there's one I see here, Larissa. I'm not sure if you see them as well, but there's one around, can legacy content be classified?
Oh, I see. Sorry.
Yeah. No problem. No problem.
I opened it.
Yeah, so the notion of legacy content, I think I mentioned that a couple of times, and the answer is yes, for sure. And that's one of the key benefits that we're working on with our customers, is that our ability to take all of these different formats, whether it's a WordStar document from decades ago, our ability to normalize that to a high-definition asset, this idea of rendering it to PDF so that you can then start to understand it and classify it, even if, again, you don't need the PDF in the end. A lot of our customers do, because they want that document of record because it's accessible, it's perfect for long-term archival, that sort of thing. But you can take those legacy formats out of those legacy repositories, clean them up, get rid of the rot, properly attribute it and classify it before it gets migrated into your system. So yeah, certainly legacy formats or legacy content can be classified. Another one here. Can you explain the content fingerprinting a little bit more? Yeah, so that's a good question. So again, I'm a whiteboard guy, so it's hard to do this over a webinar, but if you imagine a piece of content, a Word document, for example, that might have columns of text and some images, heading styles, hyperlinks, tables, that sort of thing in it, the idea is that a fingerprint can be determined based on that, all those unique attributes, not just the characters, but the position of them within the document. And there's some specific patent pending capability or technology from Adlib that we're working with that basically distills that internal content down into a very digestible fingerprint. And the value of having something that's very small and unique is that you can then start to analyze not only against its current set of content, but going forward into the future, you can continue to compare that very small piece of information, that fingerprint, with everything else that's coming through. You can imagine trying to compare the full content of a document against every new piece of content that came in. You'd never, you'd run out of computing power in a hurry. But if you've distilled that down into a very small fingerprint, you can do some really powerful things with it in terms of finding matching content, finding similar content, bucketing the content that contains some similar fingerprints. There's a lot of really cool things that you can do, but it's based on text and increasingly things like images and the overall structure of the content itself. So hopefully that helps.
I think there's one more there, Scott.
One more.
Legacy content be classified?
Yeah, we talked about the legacy one. I do see there's another one here around unstructured versus structured content. So I think I mentioned that before around the big data thing. So, and there's semi-structured, there's all kinds of different definitions, but in terms of my own speech here today, the difference between them is really what's stored in a database in terms of rows and columns. That's structured content. Things like all the transactions that you would execute with your bank, all that information is stored in a database somewhere. The unstructured content are things like your Office files, your PowerPoints, your spreadsheets, CAD files, all of these things that are created by users or created by systems, but are stored as separate document entities and assets. That's the unstructured content. And that's really hard to deal with. So this is where Adlib has sort of evolved over the last few years, even though we've been supporting hundreds of formats, hundreds of different unstructured content formats for years. It's really over the last 18 to 24 months that we've realized that deep internal insight into that content that we have and have needed to have to create the quality output that we do also prevents some really unique opportunities for our customers and partners to do some really cool things with that information. Within that unstructured content, you can start to open up some channels to things like big data analytics, or to things like this objective classification of content, attribute extraction, and some other pretty powerful things. Again, moving beyond the old paradigms of strictly focusing on surface level metadata, or the paper paradigm of flatten everything to an image and then re-OCR it and try to extract attributes from it. We've got this beautiful blend right in the middle of being able to support the born digital content as well. So hopefully that answered the structured versus unstructured question.
Okay.
Okay, so I will change presenter, I guess, to Larissa. So let me know, Larissa, if that works.
Yep, that works. Thanks, Scott. So we just wanted to close out. If there are other questions, please feel free and still ask them. We still have some time. We want to thank you for attending. And as we mentioned, this is being recorded, so you can go back and review or share with your colleagues as well. But we have access to the past webinars. The Series 1 was Content Migration and App Decommissioning Strategies. And then the Series 2 was Effective Archiving Strategies. So we do have a couple previous ones recorded if you missed them. So if there are any inquiries or further inquiries, you can contact me directly. My email is there, or you can also contact Scott as well from Adlib Software. So I don't think we see any more questions at this point. Not at this moment. But again, if anything comes up, please feel free and contact us directly, and we're happy to help you. And again, we want to thank you so much for attending. And Scott, that was a great presentation. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay. Everyone have a great day.